but I really appreciate you being here today. I was at Power Shift last night. My God, what energy. That was just absolutely amazing. We had 800 or 900 people, most of them young, so there was really this feeling of, you know, just tremendous energy and drive. And I want to tell you, I just came back from Atlantic Canada, where we're fighting a new pipeline called the Eastern Energy Pipeline. You need to know a little bit about this because you guys have been so incredibly successful in stopping the Northern Gateway and the other pipelines here, and we have held up Keystone for 3 years, and I think I'm the only person in the world who believes it, but I do think Barack Obama is going to say no to it. And so they're putting their eggs now into this Eastern pipeline. It's going to be the biggest of them all. It's bigger than Keystone, bigger than Northern Gateway. It's a huge, huge project. They're going to convert an old pipeline from Hardisty to the Quebec, middle of Quebec, and then they're going to build the rest of it, a new pipeline to St. John, New Brunswick, and build a deep sea port there to export it away. The problem in New Brunswick, of course, is that people are desperate for jobs, and so they're being told this is the best thing since sliced bread, and the polls are showing that over 2/3 of the people there want the pipeline. So it's a very, very intense fight that we've got coming up, and I think it's important for people in the West Coast to know about this because we need to be putting this together as one movement, and I'm hoping that we're going to be able to bring some of you guys out to Eastern Canada to tell the story about why you've said no here and how it's been so incredibly impactful. Oh yes, how's that? All right. Did you hear anything I said? Or I might just take this out, Harjap. Okay. There. Can you hear me? Is that better? Yeah. So the other fight that's happening there is fracking, similar to, of course, to here. And just to tell you that the New Brunswick government has set aside 20% of their land base for seismic testing. And so I'm calling New Brunswick the Pennsylvania of Canada. That's the plans that they have. So just to bring you greetings from I come from the middle, I come from Ottawa, but it's just fresh in my mind, the fight that's going on in New Brunswick. They are just going to rape that province now, and they've done it in forest and everything else, but now the Irvings and the government and the Harper government just have absolute clear plans for this. And Christy Clark, we were there because there was we put on an Alternative People Summit to the official Atlantic Energy Summit, and your Christy Clark, thank you very much. I know, no, you didn't vote for her. Thank you very much. British Columbia was there touting shale gas fracking as being a wonderful export for New Brunswick. Will make them all rich. So here we are, hewers of water, hewers of wood, you know, drawers of water, and you know, shipping out our oil all over the place. You know, and I want to talk about water in a second, but just on this energy boom and the bitumen, the problem for the industry and for the governments is that, as you know, they're landlocked in bitumen in Alberta, and they're desperate to get it out. So the rail shipments of this crude, the diluted bitumen, from the tar sands and others, fracking gas and so on, have risen exponentially, something like 800 times in just, you know, the last few years. We're trying to get numbers on the shipments of these toxics on the Great Lakes. We do know there's been a tremendous increase on shipments because now they're taking it by pipeline to the Great Lakes, shipping it across, and they're planning to build a new deep sea port in Superior, Wisconsin, to send the stuff back over to Ontario, Quebec, and out through the St. Lawrence. So they're desperate to get rid of it, and it's like, you know, one of those rugs that you push down the air bubble here, and 5 others pop up somewhere else. So it's quite the struggle that we've got around the country, and it is about human rights, and it is about many other issues, but it's very much about protection of our water. So my new little book is the third in the water trilogy. Blue Gold told the story of the corporate intrusion, the corporate invasion of water, and the desire by the private sector to control water for profit. Why they're doing it, how they're doing it. Blue Covenant basically told the story of our movement and how we're fighting back and the fight against privatization, and ended with the statement that we had to get the human right to water recognized at the United Nations and in our constitutions in different countries. So this book is based more on solutions, and basically I'll just briefly tell you the sort of big picture. And I just want to chat with you as opposed to at you too much. The big picture is that since I wrote the last 2 books, the situation in the world has deepened very much. The crisis has deepened. As a human species, the more modern we get, the more consumer-oriented, the more stuff we have, the more trade we have, the more we're destroying water. And it's not that the water isn't still on the planet somewhere, but we've either polluted it, displaced it. That's a very important part of it. We take it from where we can access it, and we ship it around the world in commodities, or we dump it in the ocean as waste. And we're mismanaging it in very, very serious ways. So the water is still here somewhere on the planet, but not accessible to us anymore. Not going to give you a million statistics. I'll give you a couple. The new study just came out so recently, it's not yet in the book, but the Greenpeace just put out a study on China that said that since 1990, half the rivers in China are gone. Now, we are not talking pollution. They're also polluted. Half the rivers in China are gone. I mean, these are breathtaking statistics. We are pulling up groundwater around the world so fast that there's no replenishing it. Nature cannot replenish it. We're basically pulling up next generation's water allotments. We are using today the water allotments for future generations. The Ogallala Aquifer, the famous aquifer that goes down the spine of the United States, and has produced most of their food for many, many decades since they discovered this circular bore well technology in the 1950s, and it went from hard scrabble farming to massive industrialized farming because they could pull that aquifer water up. They've got 200,000 of those bore wells going 24/7, and the aquifer is going. Department of Agriculture said recently that in the U.S. that the Ogallala Aquifer would be, and I quote, gone in our lifetime. Now, that's a pretty scary thing, and I thought, oh, that'll be on the front page of all the newspapers, certainly around the Great Lakes, or around, sorry, not the Great Lakes, around the western area, the Great Lakes. I've been up to the Great Lakes several times this summer, and you can stand on Lake Huron or Lake Michigan, but particularly Lake Huron, Lake Erie too. You can stand and see where the watermark, here it was, here's where it came, and it's back to the back of that room now. And this is in 4 or 5 years. We are extracting the Great Lakes, and one global study on groundwater pumping said that if we're pumping the Great Lakes at the same level and intensity that we're pumping around the world, the Great Lakes could be bone dry in 80 years. So when I tell you that we have a situation in the world where the demand is going straight up and the supply is going straight down, I mean, it is, in my opinion, the most serious crisis we have. And of course, the human fallout for this is enormous. I mean, we have a world where millions and millions and millions and millions of people do not have access to clean water. Either there's no water or there's no clean water. And billions are going without sanitation, and we're not winning the struggle around sanitation at all. Even the UN, which likes to put the rosiest figure it can on everything, is admitting that on sanitation we just can't catch it because of the growth of urban slums, people moving in, being displaced by land and water grabs, being displaced by mining, energy, big dams, millions of people displaced every year by free trade zones alone. So they're moving into these hairy urban slums in these big cities, and there's no water delivery and no sanitation for them because often they're unrecognized settlements. And lest you think that this human rights issue is just in the global south, let me tell you that where we're facing austerity measures in the global north, and where the price of water is going up and the number of poor is growing, we see this divide between rich and poor. Water is being turned off as well. There are tens of thousands of people in Detroit, inner city Detroit, Michigan, which has been declared bankrupt, you probably know, who have had their water cut off. And they literally go out and they have to take buckets and go to the local parks or schools or whatever, fill their buckets up with water and march home. The austerity measures in Europe have targeted Greece, Italy, Hungary, a number of the southern countries. And one of the ways in which they're going to, or the conditions of debt relief, should I put it that way, is that they privatize their water services and they raise the price of water dramatically. So we're seeing people being cut off in Europe, and this is unheard of. I mean, we're literally seeing, but we're seeing a wonderful movement against this privatization. So unless you think it's all bad news, there's a tremendous fight back happening as well. So I want to set the stage for you here that we are a planet running out of clean, accessible water, where demand is going up and supply is going down. And at the same time, there is a continued fierce push to privatize water. There's privatization of municipal services. There's the actual selling off of water itself in parts of the world. Chile has public auctions where they actually auction off water, and Canadian mining companies, which we should all be ashamed of, are down there outbidding local communities, local indigenous communities, local villagers, farmers for the water they need to live, and literally then taking that water and use it to pollute for their mining operations. They've bought it, they've outbid the local people. I was talking to somebody the other day who spent a fair amount of time in Peru. And just to give you an idea of how the global food market works, they have about 10 years left in the aquifer there. The local villages only have the water turned on for an hour a day, and just very slight. It's just enough to gather water for basic needs. The aquifer is being used, it's been given to a big foreign transnational agribusiness company that grows asparagus for us back north. So they are using up their aquifer, what's left of it, to produce food for export. So we need to understand this. We need to understand what the consequence of what we have all been fighting with these trade agreements and so on is doing to the human rights and the water rights of people around the world. So in this book, what I do is that I call for dramatically and urgently what I call a new water ethic. And that is simply that we have to put water at the center of our lives, and that we have to see that water is different than other things, and that we have no way of creating it or manufacturing it or copying it or whatever. We have a tiny, finite amount of water. I have a PowerPoint I sometimes use that shows the Earth stripped of all its water. So say it's this big, and it's all brown because the water's gone, and then beside it is a little round ball this big, and that's all the water on Earth. And then there's a tiny, tiny pinprick of blue. You could hardly see it, and that's all the fresh water that's on the planet. You really get an idea of how fragile and how limited and how precious it really is. And so I argue that we need a new water ethic that puts water in the center of our lives, and that all policy and that all practice has to ask the question, what is the impact on water? And if the impact on water is negative, then you can't do it, or you have to adapt it somehow. Now think about what trade policy would look like if we did this, right? I mean, you couldn't have a trade policy that gives foreign corporations the right to claim ownership of your water, which is already happening, or municipalities the right to sue if a municipality that went private with its water services decides that was a mistake and tries to go back. You wouldn't be able to stop it. That's what we're facing with the Canada-European Union CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. And people don't know this, but the Harper government several budgets ago said that any municipality that wants federal money for upgrading for infrastructure or to build new infrastructure has to go public-private partnership. And they don't get it otherwise. That was the fight in Abbotsford, which we won. But we just lost in Regina, unfortunately. There was a similar fight there. We lobbied very hard. We worked with the Canadian Union of Public Employees and others. A group called Regina Water Watch got so many signatures that we forced a referendum, but the city council and the mayor had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I am convinced the Harper government was behind it. It's a very right-wing province now, right-wing municipal government, right-wing provincial government, and of course in cahoots with Harper. And so now we're going to have a 30-year contract for a private wastewater facility in Regina because we lost the referendum. And if it's Suez or Veolia from France are one of the bidders, you can't undo it. And you just would, under a CETA, an agreement where these corporations would have the right to sue if a future government changes its mind, it would be impossible to move back. So this is how Harper is locking us in so many very, very dangerous ways. And of course, with the cutting of freshwater protections, the gutting of the Fisheries Act, the Navigable Waters Protection Act, the Environmental Assessment Act, any industry now coming in and investing in Canada can say, but those were the conditions under which we invested at the time. And if a new government comes in and reinstates those protections, we can sue for compensation, because that wasn't the deal when we came into your country. Like CNOOC, the Chinese owned, and it doesn't matter to me that it's Chinese, it could be American owned, any of these big corporations that came in after Harper had gutted these freshwater protections. After he did that, CNOOC could now say, those are the conditions under which I came in. They could also say, we came in on the understanding that there was going to be a pipeline built out west, and they could also sue over the successful fight against a pipeline. So we need to understand how we're being encircled by privatization. So what would food policy look like if we had to stop having a global food policy? And by the way, the worst destruction of water is the global agribusiness market, because we are using up water, and what happens is you're burying what's called virtual water, water that is put into a commodity that is then exported away. And if you export the commodity, you're exporting the water. And we're just beginning to understand the concept of the amount of water that's being transported out of watersheds in goods and shirts and computers and everything else, but mostly in food. What would energy policy look like, and so on. So very briefly then, I base this notion of this new water ethic on 4 principles. One of them is that water is a human right, and you know that we won that battle to an extent at the United Nations when we got the recognition 3 years ago, this past July, that water is a human right, and water and sanitation are human rights. And now we're seeing a number of nation states introduce this into their constitutions or other means, other laws. We're beginning to see some court cases that are affirming this. But in our country, of course, Canada was the last holdout. Canada didn't sign until Rio+20, when they had to sign the document all the countries signed, and it did have a statement in there on water as a human right, but we were the last country in the world. But the second, and by the way, I think we can use that water as a human right against fracking or against tar sands, against anything that is destroying local water. That is one of the obligations upon governments now under this new rule for these new resolutions at the UN, is that you cannot destroy. The government has to interfere if a third party, i.e. a corporation, is destroying the local water source. And I wanted to start testing that. The second principle is that water is a common heritage. It's a heritage of all humanity. And it belongs to all of us, and it belongs to future generations, and it belongs to the earth, and it belongs to the ecosystem. And no one can appropriate it for private profit. And we have to fight what's coming down the pike. In Alberta, they're looking at water trading, which is where you convert a license to basic property, and then you let them buy and sell and hoard. Australia did that, and I write about the consequences here. I mean, the price went way up. Investors came in and started buying it up. Global investors came in, and when a new government tried to buy water back for the water system, they couldn't afford it because it's now in the hands of the private sector. Water is literally controlled by the private sector in Australia. So that notion is an extremely important one in our fight for water as a human right. And we've been getting a number of municipalities to declare themselves blue communities, where they promote water as a human right, water as a public service and a public trust, and promoting or banning bottled water, or at least promoting tap water over public water over bottled water. And I have to tell you, I just came back from Bern, Switzerland, which just became the first non-Canadian municipality in the world to declare itself a blue community. And it was a fabulous little ceremony, and we were all over the newspaper. And the University of Bern became a blue community, and the major Reformed church became a blue community. So I would really like us to grab this concept and start getting ahead of these privatizations and go to our municipalities and go to our universities and start calling ourselves blue. That it's not just a concept, it's a promise. It's a promise to protect the water as a public trust. Then the third principle is that water has rights too, and that is the concept that beyond its usefulness to us, water has fundamental rights, and watersheds have rights, and we have to do everything in our power to protect and rebuild and restore these watersheds. When we look at climate change, we tend to think of water being affected by greenhouse gas emission-caused climate change, right? But that's the wrong way to look at it. The displacement of water from water-retentive landscapes is one of the leading causes of climate change, which I argue here, and I quote scientists here. When you cut down a rainforest, the rain goes away. There's a deep connection between vegetation, water-retentive landscape, and a healthy hydrologic cycle. And a healthy hydrologic cycle keeps the deserts from growing. It tempers the temperature. Is one of the analysis of how climate change is that we're missing in the climate movement, and it's also part of the solution. And I argue that we need to adapt and change our human laws to be more compatible with the laws of nature if we and other species are to survive. And then finally, the fourth principle, and then I'm going to shut up and talk with you, is the notion that water can teach us how to live together. And I look at the issue here as in the context of, in a world where the demand is going straight up and the supply is going straight down, what do you do? Is there going to be conflict? Is it going to be violence? Is there going to be war? And I show lots of examples where, yeah, there is already conflict and violence taking place. I show where water is being used as a weapon in many parts of the world, in Palestine, in Iraq, even the roots of the Syrian struggle has at its roots abuse around water, which is a really interesting story that I didn't know until I was more deeply studying it. So water can not just be a source of conflict, it can be a weapon that's used against communities, and it's happening around the world. But at the same time, I argue that it can be the opposite, and that when you realize that these water systems are declining and that everybody's going to be hurt together, maybe we can say, look, maybe instead of seeing it as a conflict, or I want to get my share and I don't care about your share, maybe we can say, is it possible that if we all just for a minute forget about our political and historical differences or whatever, territorial differences, and just looked at this and said, this is common. This is our common water. We can't live without it. And all of our children and their children need it too. And can it be the peacekeeping, can it form a peacekeeping role? Can water be nature's gift to teach us how to live with one another in harmony and more lightly on the earth? And I argue yes. But that takes a new concept of watershed governance, which may mean giving up sovereignty, which is going to sound like Council of Canadians. But it really does mean, because we're promoting this for the Great Lakes, that we see the Great Lakes as to be governed as a watershed, and that that it belongs to the communities and the species that live, and the First Nations that live around it. And those political boundaries, Canada, US, 8 states, 2 provinces, don't really mean anything, not to the water, not to the fish. And how can we start thinking in terms of watershed governance, and how can we think of water as being a peace giver in a world conflicted? You know those movies where there's a comet coming to the earth and all of a sudden everybody says, oh, I don't really hate you anymore because the world's going to blow up in 72 hours. So it's like, all those differences don't matter, and they send Tom Cruise or somebody else to blow it up or whatever. Well, there is a comet coming at us, and it's called the global water crisis. And I'm urging in this book that we find ways to see it as a means to peace with one another, because I think it could be nature's gift in an absolutely incredible way. So that's the concept, and I'm hoping. Okay, I'll just say one happy thing, that it's only been out a week and it's already on the Globe bestseller list, so all right. Which I'll tell you is just 2 things. People are, pardon the pun, thirsty for this information and for the political information. This is what I'm so happy, because this is hard political stuff as opposed to just an environmental look, right, which a lot of people do. But also social media. I mean, we've got our own media, guys. We really do. We don't have to depend on the mainstream media. We are telling our stories. We're getting out there. We're telling a different story through the social media and our media organizations like ours and others in a new way. And I think it's really exciting. And I just want to say that I'm hopeful, partly because it's just my nature, but also I think hope is a moral imperative, and we can catch the water situation. We're not too late. We absolutely can catch it, but we have to do it quickly, and we have to have a sense of urgency about it, and we have to find some way to break through that barrier with these politicians who continue not to talk about it. It's that myth of abundance. Oh, it'll always be here, or some technology will look after it, or somebody else will look after it. It's astounding that they continue to have presidential elections in the United States, and nobody says that 46 states are in some form of water crisis in the US. 46. Oh, well, just don't mention it then, you know. Don't mention it. Why ever mention it? Just this notion that we all grew up with, that somebody else would fix it or technology would fix it. Well, it's not going to happen. It's going to be us. So I would just love to chat with you. I don't know how our time is, but if we have a few minutes for people to argue with me, ask questions, yes. All right, technically, the question is around the right to water. What does it mean? As it stands now, the resolution at the United Nations basically talks about each person having the right to water for life. It certainly doesn't guarantee water for a swimming pool or water for a golf course, right? So just to be clear, it is water for daily living. Now, then the question becomes, how does that concept impact when there's a landlocked country that has no water? Now, technically at the moment, the interpretation at the UN is that no country is obliged to provide water for another country. Each country must set out a process whereby they provide the human right to water and sanitation to their own people. That's the interpretation. However, the question you're asking is a really important one in the future, because I do think there's going to come a time when some countries are going to say, but you, by the luck of nothing, just because that's where the borders were drawn, you have water and we don't. And I expect at some point in the future there's going to be a discussion around the human right to water between water area haves and have-nots. Technically at the moment, no, it's very clear what the interpretation at the UN is. But I expect in a world running out of water, we're going to see more of that kind of question. And I make a big distinction between sharing water for need and commercial sales of water. And I just want us to keep that in our heads as well. I do know that the groundwater here is absolutely unprotected, and that is just absolutely terrible. I mean, it's bad enough in Ontario, they charge $3.71 per million liters. Can you believe it? That's where the other big Nestle operation is. And by the way, I'm not suggesting they charge Nestle. I don't believe there should be bottled water takings at all. So, but I do think that, okay, I'll back up, and then I want to come to charging. Remind me if I forget, I want to talk about charging for raw water. But what we need to do here is that we need to protect surface and groundwater as a public trust. Now, I'll give you an example. I worked in Vermont, or with the Vermont legislature, in helping them design their legislation. They, like British Columbia, had no groundwater protection, and they had all sorts of companies, particularly bottled water companies, coming in and just pumping local water sources dry. So they, with a group of us working with them, they proposed, and I love this story, it was a woman state Republican senator and a woman state Democratic senator who together put this before the Vermont legislature, and it passed unanimously. They adopted legislation that called all of their water a public trust, and they went further and they basically said that in times of any kind of conflict or shortage, there would be priorities, which I think we need to start thinking about. What are the priorities for our water? And they said water for daily living, people's living needs, water for ecosystem protection, and the third was water for local sustainable food production rather than water for this big agribusiness that ships all this stuff out of the country. Wow, dream about that. I mean, dream about that. What control that would give us over not only our water, but what we're doing with the water and how to promote local sustainable food production, which is one of the most important answers to the global food crisis. I also think and I start this discussion in here, and it's a tough one, and Harjap knows this, we've gone back and forth over this, but I believe that right now the burden on paying for water services falls on taxpayers, which is fine, because I believe that's where it belongs, but also on service charges. But the service charges tend to be for residents, families, and small businesses. And these raw water users, whether they're hydroelectric or whether they're big agribusiness or whether they're bottled water, whatever, although as I say, I don't think we should give bottled water access, but the big users of raw water, computer makers, often, not only do they not pay any money for this water, in places they're subsidized for it. And so I feel we have to say, as the stewards of the water, and I shouldn't use the word owners, but as the stewards, the water that, we are the stewards of the water, it is a public trust. We are telling our government that they have to manage that water in the best interest of the stewards, of the people, and of the land, and charge a license fee if it's a legitimate use of the water. If it's not a legitimate use, you don't get it. But if it is, but you're making a profit from it, you need to pay a license fee, kind of like a royalty fee. And I feel we have to start having that discussion, because as the price of water goes up, it's going to come more and more and more on individuals and families, and that's going to put a disproportionate balance on those people.